So I've been spending a lot of time testing out all of the characters in Granblue Fantasy Relink since we got the brand new update, because not only did a lot of characters end up being directly buffed, but all of them saw the introduction of the Warpath sigils, which in some cases led to a huge increase in damage. And so in today's video I will be ranking every single character in Granblue Fantasy Relink, including the two newcomers, to decide who exactly are the best characters in the game. There is a lot to talk about, so without any further ado, let's get started. And the first character on the list is going to be none other than Lancelot. Lancelot was already a very powerful character in Relink, being able to dodge out of the way of anything while dealing damage, and as we got introduced to more difficult fights with Lucilius and now Behemoth, having a character that can reliably not take any damage is going to be very powerful. And if you go with the flight over fight and nimble onslaught setup, you essentially become immortal and are able to defeat anything by simply pressing a single button. And with the new Warpath sigil, you're able to simply deal more damage by doing exactly what you were already able to do, so you'll be able to generate tons of SPA gauge, all the while being able to freeze enemies and not take any damage. Lancelot is still lacking a little bit behind when it comes to damage, but I think that he more than makes up for it with everything that he has going on in his kit. In addition to that, we saw the addition of the new bug in update 1.2.0 that allows Lancelot to cancel his ranged skill, to remove the damage cap of that skill and easily deal millions of damage in an instant. Now, I'm not going to take that bug into consideration because it is likely going to be fixed, but I do want to mention it because it is important. Having said that, even without taking that bug into consideration, now that we have more difficult fights in the game, I would actually rank Lancelot as an S tier character. Now, the next character on the list is going to be the Captain. Unfortunately, the Captain was one of the few characters that ended up being nerfed, as the developers removed some of the skill cancels that you were able to use, which allowed Captain, especially Jita, to be able to push through a ton of damage. And on top of that, the Captain did not see any compensation buffs, so they ended up lagging behind a little bit. That being said, the Captain still has a lot of utility and party-wide support that they are able to provide, and you're still able to abuse the skill substitute, combine it with nimble onslaught and flight over fight, and you're essentially able to make everyone in your party invincible for a very long period of time, while at the same time raising the skybound art gauge very quickly. That being said, when it comes to actually dealing damage, the Captain does still lag behind, and sadly the only CC that they have is a slow, which doesn't end up feeling very impactful. Now, it should be noted that the Captain in update 1.2.0 has access to the same bug that Lancelot has, that allows them to deal upwards of 230 million damage in the 60-second test, and that is absolutely absurd. But I won't be taking that into account because that is likely going to be fixed in the next update, but let's just say that if you are using that bug that I showed in one of my previous videos, the Captain would immediately go to S tier. However, given the lack of damage without that bug, and we having access to even more utility from other characters in the game, and even when taking into account the Captain's Warpath sigil, their damage output remains too low compared to other characters that I would rank higher, so ultimately I will be ranking the Captain as an A tier character. And up next we have Narmaya, a character that can swap between two different stances, one that is focused on rapid quick strikes, and the other stance being focused on wide charged attacks. Narmaya was always capable of dealing a ton of damage, and if you remove any of the combo cancels that were present in the base game, she along with Charlotta were actually the highest damage dealing characters. So now that a lot of those skill cancels were removed from the game, you would expect Narmaya to be a top tier character. But I do believe that there is a little bit of a debate here. Narmaya can hit some pretty crazy damage numbers, especially if you're able to swap between the stances at the right time, keep the combo going and parry incoming attacks, all the while using her powerful buff that gives her supplementary damage, and Setsuna for some crazy screenshot damage numbers. That being said, as a character, Narmaya kinda relies on a little bit of RNG to get the most out of her. What I mean by that is that, for example, one of her unique sigils, Butterfly's Valor, gives Narmaya a 50% chance to not consume her butterflies whenever she uses her skills. And given that the butterflies are a huge source of damage for Narmaya, each time you use a skill you are essentially coin flipping whether or not you're going to deal a lot more damage. Now, she did receive a Warpath sigil which allows her to deal a lot more damage, essentially gaining a buff for 15 seconds whenever she performs a stance shift combo that is going to give her 15% enhanced damage and 10% supplementary damage. The downside of this sigil, however, is that it's going to reduce Narmaya's SBA gauge gain by 50%. And given that in the current endgame of Granblue Fantasy Relink, the real meta of the game to optimize each quest and to deal as much damage as possible and have fast clear times is to build up the SBA gauge very quickly and keep on using the SBA independently, with each player going one after another and essentially not allowing the boss to do anything but sit there and take damage. And by using this Warpath sigil, Narmaya would essentially be anchoring her SBA gauge gain, which could hinder her overall performance and that of the entire party. Still, I do believe that she is a very powerful character. Again, she deals a lot of damage, especially if you are lucky, and she does have some utility that she can bring to the party in the form of a defense down, as well as a slow on top of 2 buffs that allow her to increase her defense, and this one increasing her attack, giving her supplementary damage, and Stout Heart, which on top of making her uninterruptible, gives her a 20% damage reduction. So at the end of the day, Narmaya is a very powerful character that is just this very close to making it to the top of the list, but personally I wouldn't quite put her in S tier just yet, maybe if she gets a direct buff or a way to not rely on the RNG as much. Now the next character on the list is going to be Zeta, a character that can infinitely keep on looping her combos, all the while avoiding attacks and dealing a ton of damage. Zeta was a powerful character before, but she was underperforming in a few aspects, and given that she needed to go into her aerial loop to deal damage, and that was something that you couldn't do reliably on some bosses, Zeta would occasionally suffer from these mechanics, and as such she would feel lackluster in some scenarios. That being said, her damage output was actually quite respectable, and thankfully it was directly buffed in update 1.2.0. So not only does Zeta now deal more damage with her regular loop attacks, but she is also much better at being able to stay in the air doing the same combo over and over again without losing a lot of DPS by not going into the combo finisher. Additionally, Zeta saw the introduction of her Warpath sigil, which is absolutely ridiculous. With this sigil, Zeta is able to inflict the Arves Formare debuff on the enemy, which allows her to deal more damage pretty much whenever she wants by performing a successful parry, and by doing this not only does she avoid taking damage and apply said debuff, but she also gains an enhanced 15% damage on top and gains a whopping 100% critical hit rate, which means that if you are good enough with Zeta, you can actually forego of any critical hit rate improvement that you have on your build and simply focus on adding damage dealing sigils or more utility. On top of that, it should also be noted that Zeta has access to paralysis with the Wing Clipper skill, and with paralysis being by far the best crowd control that you can get in this game, having a character that can not only deal tons of damage but also apply the best CC in the game is going to bring you a lot more success. It should also be noted that Zeta is one of those characters that has the bugged ranged skill, where if you dodge it at the right time right after you perform it, you're able to remove the damage cap of said skill and deal a ton of damage. Again, I'm not going to be taking that into consideration, but even then I would argue that Zeta has become one of the best characters in the game because she's able to avoid so much damage and so many annoying things by just being able to go up into the air. She has a parry, she has a paralysis, and she deals a lot of damage. And so at the end of the day, I'm going to be ranking Zeta as an S tier character. Now the next character on the list is going to be Sandalphon, one of the 2 newcomers in update 1.2.0. Sandalphon is a very agile character that is able to deal tons of damage by summoning his avatar much in the same way that Catalina does. That being said, Sandalphon does have the upper hand when it comes to dealing damage, especially with the secret combo route that you guys have shown me that he has, which will allow him to build up his avatar gauge while still dealing a lot more damage very quickly. Additionally, as a damage dealer, Sandalphon can be very reliable as he is able to sustain himself and take reduced damage from the Stout Heart that he can very easily gain access to. On top of that, despite relying on the avatar to deal more damage, Sandalphon's avatar finisher doesn't actually deal a ton of damage, which means that you're able to use your avatar for a longer period of time to deal more damage. He is a bit lacking when it comes to CC, only having a slow that he can use, and when it comes to utility, Inspirazione is actually a very decent buff, being able to grant Sandalphon hostility, a 30% defense buff, and debuff immunity. But of course, Sandalphon's most iconic skill is the 7 stars brilliance, which will allow you to max out the SBA gauge of the entire party, which is absolutely absurd, but then again it has the downside of having a massive cooldown, which means that realistically you'll only be able to use this skill in a handful of quests. It's not ideal, but this will allow Sandalphon and his allies to have a much easier time with pretty much any fight in the game. And again, despite his damage output being very good, it's not anything too crazy, hovering around the 45 million in the 60-second test, and so Sandalphon ends up being this character that not only is he very easy to pick up and use, and that you can pilot very comfortably thanks to his sigil that can grant him Stout Heart and Rain, but he is also capable of dealing a great amount of damage, dealing upwards of 45 million in the 60-second damage test, and again for some of the harder fights you have the ability to instantly fill up the SPA gauge for everyone, provided that the fight has gone on long enough for you to be able to use it. It may take some time for people to get used to him, but I really do believe that Sandalphon is an amazing addition to the cast of Relink, and so while he does not have the crowd control that I wish he had, I'm still going to be ranking Sandalphon as an S tier character. Now the next character on the list is going to be my beloved Id. A character that, despite how much I liked him, I ended up ranking him very low in the past due to how many problems he had with the dragon form and godmight transformations. However, since then, Id has seen a ton of significant direct buffs that have made him much more powerful. Essentially, they straight up increased his damage and raised the damage cap for every single thing that Id can do during the godmight form. And when you compare the damage numbers of the before and after, the difference is actually pretty crazy. On top of that, there is of course the Warpath Sigil, that in the case of Id works in a very peculiar way. It essentially cuts down on the duration of each of your transformations by half. However, all of those transformations end up dealing a lot more damage, and you're not going to go from dragon form into godmight right away after filling up your gauge, and you're also not going to be ending godmight form by simply doing the powerful combo finisher, which in practical terms means that Id is capable of using that incredibly powerful finisher 3 to 5 times in a row if you are able to set it up well. However, there is a little bit of a caveat to that, and that is that the transformation timings can sometimes be very unfortunate, where for example a monster will go into Bloodthirst and you won't be able to damage the boss, and you are losing the precious seconds that you have with your different transformations. So it really does take a lot of skill and practice to nail down the timings and get used to the right rotations for you to be able to use the transformations at the right time. So I can totally see why some people would not like the new Warpath Sigil for Id, as it can occasionally cause these problems and actually be a deterrent. Still, I do believe that Id is ultimately in a much better place than he was before, and honestly, if these restrictions were not put in place, I really do believe that Id would belong in the S tier. But because there are still so many constraints to this character, which is partially why he is so cool and fun to play, I do have to rank him down just a little bit, and let's be honest, his damage output is still very good, but not quite at the level of some of the monsters in the top tier, so Id is going into the A tier. Up next we have none other than Eugen, one of the few ranged characters of the cast that can pretty much do it all. Not only is he capable of dealing a ton of damage from a safe distance, but he is also able to provide a ton of value to the party by bringing down the enemy's defense and also poisoning them. He's able to heal party members with Healing Bullet, can even give himself Stout Heart to get damage reduction, and above all is able to paralyze the enemy with Paralyzing Bullet. So right off the bat, Eugen pretty much fills up all of the criteria for being a top tier character. But that is not all. In addition to that, the new Warpath Sigil gives Eugen a lot more damage by giving him 25% enhanced damage for charged attacks and grenades that were detonated by charged attacks. Sadly, I don't think that the Warpath Sigil is going to benefit the grenade spam playstyle, but still I do believe that this is a very powerful sigil, and again, Eugen is just a very solid character all around. Now I do believe that his damage output is actually going to be lower in the couple of recent fights that we got in Lucilius and Behemoth, compared to the numbers he was able to deal in Proto Bahamut, because for example his laser would be able to pierce and hit multiple parts at the same time, and given that Behemoth and Lucilius especially are both much smaller targets, that may result in Eugen dealing a little less damage. Still, he's a fantastic character that can put out a ton of damage very safely and still provide utility to the party, so at that point, what more would you want from a character? Eugen goes straight to the S tier. Now the next character is going to be Percival, a character that once stood at the very top of the rankings by having a ton of damage with his skill cancels and the Rotor Warble bug. Percival is a character that can still offer a very good amount of damage with his skills and his charged attack, the Schlatt, that you can charge up quicker by using skills beforehand. Thankfully, the developers noted how Percival had been gutted in the Lucilius update by removing all of those interactions, and so in update 1.2 they ended up increasing the damage cap of the charged attacks, while also increasing the damage cap of the Rotor Warble. They have also made it that you are able to charge up the Schlatt quicker after performing a normal combo without doing any combo finish, finishers, though I am not sure if that is going to be very effective. Ultimately, Percival is a character that, much like with Rackham, doesn't offer much besides damage. Though it should be noted that Percival has a little bit of crowd control with X Seal that lowers the enemy's defense on top of making them slower. And thankfully, Percival's Warpath Sigil is actually quite powerful, as it is going to give you a 10% supplementary damage buff for 30 seconds and give you 30% enhanced damage if you land a successful charged parry. Now, it does take some time to get used to Percival's parry timing, because you need to charge up your attack to actually do it, though if you are able to master the timing, you'll be able to deal a lot more damage with a character that can already deal quite competitive damage. And so, because Percival doesn't offer much besides damage, and while his damage output is actually very good, it's not quite enough when compared to the characters in S tier, and you need to put in more effort to actually get to those numbers, so I'm going to be ranking Percival as an A tier character. Now, the next character on the list is going to be Charlotta. She was already incredibly powerful before the Lucilius update, and quite frankly, she has only become more powerful since then. Not only is she a character that can deal a ton of damage with her combo cancels, all the while having access to a skill that makes her invincible, and another one that grants a 50% damage reduction to the entire party, all of that was already enough to make Charlotta an S tier character. And when on top of all of that you add the Lucilius Sigils, which allows her to hit the damage cap a lot more easily, but then you combine that with the Holy Knight's Warpath, which essentially allows Charlotta to be nearly permanently in noble stance, all the while dealing 10% enhanced damage, which in turn is going to free up some of Charlotta's skill slots for some more utility skills, and it's just going to make her a lot easier to play and optimize, and you get all of those benefits with no drawbacks whatsoever. I really mean this when I say that if there were no bugged characters currently in Granblue Fantasy Relink, Charlotta would absolutely be the #1 best character in the game by far, so it goes without asking that Charlotta is an easy S tier character. Now, the next character on the list is none other than Toyen, the second new addition to the cast of Relink. As a ranged character, she has a massive advantage over other characters, being able to hit the enemies from a distance, and she is actually very mobile and her combos are very easy to execute, and so you're able to maintain your powerful damage rotation with ease, which is very important. As such, she is able to constantly keep dealing damage to the enemies, which in turn is going to allow her to build up the SPA gauge and the link gauge a lot quicker, and that is always a huge positive. And of course, the biggest benefit that Toyen brings to any party is the way that she's able to apply a massive amount of debuffs on the enemy very easily, with the skill Depravity being able to inflict attack down, defense down, burn, poison, slow, and even paralysis through her support skill. And that is just going to make the fight a whole lot easier. And then on top of that, she is able to deal more damage to enemies that are already inflicted with debuffs, so she ends up being a character with a very powerful supportive kit that at the same time is very fulfilling and fun to play with. That being said, Toyen ends up feeling very much behind in the damage department, so while she is essentially a top tier character when it comes to utility and comfort, simply because of her lack of damage when compared to the monsters of this game, I am ultimately going to be ranking Toyen as an A tier character. Up next we have my boy Vazuraga, one of the slowest characters in the game. Vazuraga is all about doing the powerful charged attacks, and after the removal of the skill cancels that Vazuraga and many other characters were using during the Lucilius update, Vazuraga kind of found himself lacking when it came to damage. Now, it should be noted that Vazuraga can still perform the combo cancels, he simply can't go into Great Scythe and cancel that into a powerful charged attack. The best way to deal damage with Vazuraga right now is to cancel a couple of basic attacks and then go into a couple of charged attacks. And to this effect, he was actually buffed in update 1.2, as the developers have made it that the quick charge trait is a lot more effective for charging up attacks faster with Vazuraga. That is on top of raising the Skybound art damage cap. Still, with all of this, Vazuraga remains a very consistent and powerful character that can deal a lot of damage, and with the Immortal Pain skill, Vazuraga is able to stay at 1 HP and not die, that is on top of gaining an attack boost and debuff immunity. On top of that, he can inflict slow on enemies, so he can provide some CC to the party, and he can kind of act like a tank by using Nether Ward, which makes it so that Vazuraga can take damage in place of his allies, which you can combine of course with Immortal Pain, and then all of your allies will not take any damage, and you yourself, because you have the Undying buff, you also won't die, so you don't have to worry about that. And because Vazuraga has access to innate Stout Heart, that can actually work very well on a coordinated party to make sure that everyone can can avoid taking damage, and they can ignore the mechanics and just focus on dealing damage to the boss. However, that is not all. Like all the other characters, Vazaraga has access to his own Warpath Sigil, and this one works in a very interesting way. This sigil allows Vazaraga to consume his own HP to fill up his gauge by pressing the triangle button or right click, as long as his gauge is at 1 or higher. This on top of all of the benefits that your gauge provides, giving you attack up, defense up, and stout heart. You will also gain a 30% enhanced damage buff for 45 seconds. Of course, it comes at the cost of consuming 30% of your HP to fill up the gauge, but with Vazaraga having the Immortal Pain skill and you being able to easily mend that problem by adding Potion Hoarder to your build, you are essentially just getting 30% more damage for Vazaraga very easily. It can get somewhat problematic if used at the wrong times, and since the skill cancel for Vazaraga was removed, you're no longer able to essentially have a permanent uptime on the Immortal Pain skill like you used to before. Or at least you can't through normal means. You may be able to if you go with something like Nimble Onslaught, though in my opinion that is not entirely reliable. Still, Vazaraga remains a very strong character capable of dealing a ton of damage, power through anything with stout heart, and having a way to not die to anything and also make sure that your allies don't die to anything, that is extremely valuable. And so at the end of the day, even though one of Vazaraga's biggest damaging tools was essentially removed, he's still an insanely strong character capable of dealing around 60 million damage in the 60-second test, and still has all of these benefits, and so I'm placing Vazaraga as an S tier character. Next on the list we have Vayne, a character that by performing combo finishers can fill up his beatdown gauge, that once full allows him to unleash a more powerful combo. On top of that, every single combo finisher and heavy attack that Vayne does counts as a guard, which when coupled with Vayne's sigils and skills allows him to be probably the most sustainable character in the entire game. As if your Vayne is well built enough, he can essentially just keep on running towards the enemy and keep on attacking every single time, and he will be able to make it through. That being said, Vayne's damage output isn't anything spectacular. In fact, it's actually quite low when compared to the rest of the other characters. In addition to that, prior to the Lucilius update, Vayne's optimal combo was to actually do a couple of light attacks into the combo finisher, as that would allow him to deal more damage. However, since that ended up being changed, his damage output ended up going lower. That being said, Vayne ended up getting a bunch of direct buffs in update 1.2, with one of the most impactful buffs, making it so that Vayne's follow-up link attack comes out a lot quicker, as that sometimes would put you in danger and you would get hit in the process. In addition to that, the developers have boosted the damage cap of the beatdown combos, and they have made it so that Vayne will be a lot more powerful during lane time. They've also changed the way that the skill Energy Destruction works, because the way that the skill is intended to be used is to deal more damage the higher your SPA gauge is. But prior to this update, you would be able to use this skill at 0% SPA gauge and still deal the maximum damage. That has now been changed, and you will actually deal more damage with higher SPA gauge, though you will still be able to hit the damage cap without actually having the SPA gauge full. In addition to that, the new Warpath Sigil is actually quite powerful. Whenever Vayne is doing his normal combos, and he eventually blocks an attack with his own triangle attack, not only will he fill up his beatdown gauge by 12.5% each time he does this, but he will also gain a buff enhancing his damage by 30%. And with how often you're able to trigger this in an actual fight, especially against bosses that have a lot of area of effect damage, like Behemoth for example, you'll be able to trigger this very often. So in that sense, you're able to deal a lot more damage with Vayne compared to before. Even then, I would not necessarily say that his damage output is anything impressive, but it certainly has improved. Now another thing to keep in mind is Vayne's skills that allow for him to be a very sustainable character that can be taken into any quest, and he will always be valuable because he is very hard to take down. Having a very short gap closer that deals damage and heals for a portion of the damage dealt, a buff that can grant him a 30% increase in attack and defense while also providing him with guts, and if you already have the trait guts, you can combine it with this and you are essentially never going down. On top of Soul Eruption, a skill that you can use to gain a 50% attack and defense increase while also fully healing Vayne and removing any debuffs you may have. And then of course there is Ramparts, the big shield that Vayne can put down, and everyone that stays within it is going to be invincible for a prolonged period of time. Now it should be noted that some of the more recent boss fights like Lucilius and Behemoth don't give you a lot of time to use Rampart, especially Lucilius, so you need to know the fight and act quick to be able to use this efficiently. Otherwise you're going to get hit while you are activating Rampart and you won't be able to actually use use it. Still, Vayne is a very powerful defensive character, and if you are having trouble with pretty much any content in the game, he is probably the number 2 character that I would recommend, second only to Lancelot. But because Vayne doesn't offer any form of crowd control and his damage output is again not that amazing, I am ultimately going to be ranking Vayne as an A tier character. Now the next character on the list is going to be Catalina, a character that by attacking is capable of filling up the Ares gauge, and then by performing combo finishers, link attacks or skills is able to summon Ares in combat to deal more damage with her combos and skills or to empower certain utility skills. As such, Catalina is very much the burst window type of character when it comes to damage, and ultimately that ends up setting her back a little bit. That being said, she comes in clutch with a lot of utility and support skills, having the ability to provide Stout Heart, which gives you damage reduction as well as a 15% defense bonus, the ability to kill herself or the entire party, or even the ability to make everyone invincible for a certain period of time. Granted that for these two skills to affect the entire party, you would need to have Ares summon. And of course we cannot forget about Sacred Winds, which gives her the ability to freeze an enemy, which gives everyone an ample time to deal damage. Now the reason why I didn't quite put Catalina in the S tier before was the lack of damage output, and because the freeze itself, while it is a good CC ability, the fact that Catalina herself has to be stay put in place to hold the monster frozen essentially makes that form of crowd control a worse paralysis, since it's going to be 3 people dealing damage to the boss as opposed to 4. Though I know that Sacred Winds does deal damage, but the damage output is actually very little. And again, because you do need the Ares gauge to deal damage, and you also need to summon Ares to have all of this support and utility effect, the idea of this paladin type character that deals damage but also protects the party ends up feeling a lot less important and impactful when you have characters that are capable of doing essentially the same and can still have a much better damage output and are a lot more consistent. In addition, the new Warpath sigil that Catalina has received is very conditional on a couple of things. What this does is, after Catalina performs a Skybound art, she is able to provide to herself and the entire party a 45-second debuff immunity and a 25% enhanced damage buff for again 45 seconds. And 45 seconds is a lot of time, especially in this game where a lot of boss fights go by very quickly. The problem with this Warpath sigil is that again, you are essentially just not having any Warpath sigil until this takes effect, and when you compare this to some of the more powerful Warpath sigils like Siegfried's, Charlotta's, or Percival's for example, it honestly ends up feeling somewhat lackluster unless you go into online multiplayer lobbies where you have people coordinating their Skybound arts and are able to quickly build them up using characters like Charlotta, Cagliostro, Io, and Lancelot. But if you are playing by yourself and only your AI companions, this would essentially be an awful Warpath sigil. And again, because you are able to get still so many defensive options and better CC from other characters in the game, at this point if you want to deal damage with Catalina, she is just going to feel like a much weaker Sandalphon. So ultimately I will be ranking Catalina as a B tier character, and she's going into B tier specifically because of her utility, because if you are having trouble clearing some content, she is going to help you a lot, but for anything else there are so many better options. Next on the list we have Yodarha, one of the shortest characters that is all about dealing fast and agile combos, having a built-in parry that also gives him supplementary damage, and all around being a character that is capable of avoiding taking damage very easily thanks to his skill that can grant a mirror image, as well as Yodarha himself becoming untargetable while he is performing his combo finishers. He's by far one of the most reliable characters when you want to take a character that can just do very well. They may not be top tier when it comes to damage or crowd control, but at the very least you're going to have an easy time with the game, and if you are doing well, your damage output is actually going to be very competitive. It doesn't quite reach the levels of the monsters in the upper tiers, but it's still very respectable. Now Yodarha did receive quite a few updates in 1.2, increasing the damage cap on successful counters triggered by the skill Tit for Tat, as well as increasing the damage cap of Flashing Void and Sky Shatter based on the number of marks that you have. Essentially the developers just made him more powerful and reliable by buffing the skills that in my opinion were already quite strong. For one, let's be honest, the Lucilius and Behemoth fights are a lot harder compared to everything else in the game. They're still not too difficult, but with this skill you're able to provide Yodarha and everyone else in the party the mirror image buff that allows you to take up to 3 hits without taking damage. And so that is going to make clearing the hardest content in the game a lot easier. Again, Yodarha doesn't have any crowd control that he can provide to the party, but with skills like Flashing Void that allow him to deal a lot of damage while still avoiding avoiding taking damage, he's going to be able to have a very good uptime on damage, whereas other characters may struggle to do so. And this is especially apparent again against Lucilius and Behemoth. And as for his new Warpath Sigil, the Swordmaster's Warpath is going to grant him a 30% enhanced damage, but only when you perform the short follow-up combos whenever you're training up with the Sharpened Focus. This enhanced damage essentially refers to whenever you are stringing together different combo finishers, and after doing 3 of these back to back to back, you're able to keep on spamming these combo finishers together very quickly, and that is what's going to be buffed by the enhanced damage. So it's not very consistent, it's not going to apply to most of Yodarha's kit, which is maybe a little bit disappointing, but it's certainly going to result in you dealing more damage. Ultimately, Yodarha is just a very solid character that while he doesn't excel at anything, he does still bring a lot of value to the party, and again his damage output and the way that he is able to do it very safely should not be underestimated. And so I'm ranking Yodarha as an A tier character. Next on the list we have Rackham, a character that was essentially gutted in the Lucilius update by removing the aerial shotgun Rackham playstyle that allowed him to deal upwards of 80 million damage. He was seriously insanely broken, very easy to use and just an outright menace. But of course that was due to a bugged interaction, so how good is Rackham nowadays? Well, he's actually very good, and in some ways he's better than he was before. So let me explain. Rackham actually did get quite a few buffs in update 1.2, increasing the damage cap of his well-timed attacks, his launch attack, the skilled bullet hail, and finally the damage cap of the bullseye blast depending on the charge level. So essentially the developers just raised Rackham's damage output across the board. And so Rackham being a character that is pretty much all about damage, he doesn't really provide crowd control and he also doesn't offer any buffs to the party, these direct buffs ended up being very significant. In addition to that, his new Warpath Sigil gives Rackham a 20% enhanced damage buff for 15 seconds after he performs 3 rhythmic triggers within a certain amount of time, those being Rackham's well-timed basic attacks. So if you like to stay at a distance with Rackham and only using his well-timed basic attacks, this is going to result in you dealing a lot more damage. And compared to before, that playstyle is much stronger. That being said, I would not go as far as to say that Rackham is stronger than he was when the game first released. He's still a very solid character and by far one of the most useful ones whenever you are AFK farming, but again, he doesn't offer any CC or buffs to the party and his damage output could be even more powerful. And in my opinion, that puts him somewhere between the B and A tier. Now because the damage output is actually very good, I'm not going to be placing Rackham in B tier, but he is going to the bottom of A tier. Now up next we have Io, the ranged caster that is able to inflict the enemy with a lot of debuffs, but can also deal a ton of damage and build up the SPA gauge in an instant. Io was already a very powerful character in the base game, and I believe at one point she may have actually been the character capable of dealing the highest damage number in a single hit. Being a ranged character already has so many advantages, and much like with Tuyen, she's able to provide a ton of utility to her party, being able to inflict the enemy with paralysis, defense down and attack down, though it may not seem like it initially. And with time and better sigils, Io has only gotten better, with the addition of her new Warpath Sigil, granting Io a 15% enhanced damage for 15 seconds after landing a fully charged Stargaze at max orbs. And if that wasn't enough, this sigil also grants Io a 50% chance to not consume said Mystic Vortex orbs, which she very much relies on to deal a lot of damage. So we're kind of in a similar situation to Narmaya, where we are now gambling to deal more damage. And if you are successful, you don't get it twisted and you do win, then Io's damage output is going to be absolutely ridiculous. And again, let's not discredit everything else that she has going for her, in the form of utility, her fast SBA gauge gain, and the fact that she is a ranged character. There's not much more to say here, I really do believe that Io belongs in the S tier. The next character on the list is going to be none other than Siegfried, one of the hardest characters to perfectly execute and get the most out of his kit in the entire game, but one that previously did not get a lot of reward and payback out of doing so. I love Siegfried, but let's be honest, the damage that he was dealing before was simply not that great. Even if you were to do the combo cancels, where you essentially skip parts of your combo by dodging like a madman, to then be able to use the powerful combo finishers to deal more damage, still landed them in the middle of the pack when it came to damage. That being said, thankfully Siegfried has aged like fine wine. Not only did he receive direct buffs that quite simply raised the damage cap of his perfectly timed attacks, which is pretty much the essential part of Siegfried's core kit, but he has also received one of the best Warpath sigils, which quite simply grants him 40% enhanced damage on all of his perfectly timed attacks. So that is just a 40% damage increase on top of everything you already do. The downside of this sigil is that it is going to reduce your defense by 50%, but given that Siegfried has access to one of the craziest skill setups when it comes to sustain, being able to raise the defense of the entire party by 70%, boosting his own attack and defense by 30%, and also granting himself and the entire party drain and debuff immunity, you will still be able to essentially be the same tank that you were before, powering through any incoming attack, but this time you're going to be doing a lot more damage. And because Siegfried's offensive skills don't do a lot of damage, it's totally okay for you to let go of all of those offensive skills, focus on the more utility aspect, and the raw attacks will do the damage. And again, the damage is going to be actually very good. He still requires skill and practice for you to land those perfectly timed attacks, but it is undeniable that Siegfried is now a menace in Relink, and as such I will be ranking him as an A tier character. He doesn't quite reach the S tier because the damage output just isn't there, and the lack of CC also doesn't help either. Now the next character on the list is going to be Gendagoza, one of the slowest characters in the game that by performing perfectly timed attacks is able to fill up the eternal rage meter to be able to unleash a powerful raging fist. Sadly however, due to how the game is balanced and the damage cap being so low, Gendagoza has always been one of the most underwhelming characters in the game, because for one, he is a slow character and doesn't have a lot of reach, he doesn't offer a lot of support and utility to his party, and the overall damage output is just very low. So going into update 1.2.0, we were really hoping to see some direct buffs to Gendagoza, and sadly we didn't get to see a single one. However, that is not to say that Gendagoza has not become stronger. In fact, he is a lot more powerful than he was when the game initially released, with the biggest addition being of course the Warpath sigil, which is going to give Gendagoza's Raging Fist a 100% enhanced damage buff, with the downside of doubling its charge time. Now in practical terms, this is going to result in Gendagoza being able to deal more damage, and thanks to his combo cancels, he can actually get to the Raging Fist a lot quicker, so you'll be able to use it and take advantage of the Warpath sigil more often. And it should be noted that Gendagoza with the Warpath sigil is actually an insane monster during link time now, since one of your masteries allows you to use your Raging Fist without actually having to charge it. So you'll be able to spam that attack, dealing millions of damage each time and just blowing through the boss's HP. Now I believe that the current meta for Gendagoza is to actually remove all of your skills and go with the less is more sigils, and again rely on the combo cancels to get to the Raging Fist. However, I feel like there is a bit of a conflict in that playstyle, because if you are not using any skills, you're going to be building up your link gauge a lot slower, and you really want to hit link time with Gendagoza since that is your biggest DPS window. And because you also don't have any skills, you're going to be building up your SBA gauge a lot slower, so there are a lot of caveats to this Gendagoza playstyle, and there's still a few problems with this character. So while I do recognize that he is a lot more powerful than he was before, and again he is a link time monster, given how rare it is to actually proc link time nowadays against most bosses, and given that Gendagoza himself, despite wanting to proc link time, is going to be the one that is going to contribute towards it the least, it's hard for me to give Gendagoza a good rating on the tier list, especially with how powerful everyone is. And so, call me crazy, but I'm still going to place Gendagoza in the C tier. He is definitely not a bad character, but I feel like there are a lot of things that could be improved, and so that is where I'm placing him on the tier list. Now the next character is going to be Cagliostro, a ranged caster that is able to deal a lot of damage by performing combo cancels, that also has access to some of the best support and utility skills in the entire game. So Cagliostro didn't really change too much from the base game to now. She is still a premium support character if that is what you wish to bring to your party, as she has by far one of the best buffs in the game, being able to raise attack, defense and critical hit rate, which she is the only one that is capable of doing so with the Phantasmagoria buff. She's also able to heal and revive someone, remove a buff from an enemy, lower their attack, and through the use of her unique sigil also lower the enemy's defense whenever she uses a charged attack. And again, her damage output is actually quite respectable thanks to her combo cancels. They can be somewhat tricky to pull off consistently, but once you do get the timing down, you won't forget about them. That being said, some of the utility that Cagliostro provides still ends up being somewhat wasted, because very often you're able to hit the damage cap without relying on the defense down on the enemies, and you're also going to be maxing out the critical hit rate for most characters by the time you reach the endgame, so Phantasmagoria and the rest of the buffs are going to lose a lot of value. Now at the moment, Cagliostro is another one of the characters that can cancel her ranged skill, in this case being Alexandria, which allows her to deal a ton of damage by removing the damage cap of the skill. It's a bug that is likely to be fixed, so I won't take that into account. So given the current state of Relink, I really don't see Cagliostro as being an incredibly powerful character to bring to a party unless you're abusing the bug. And that is even when taking into account her Warpath Sigil, which gives her 10 to 15% enhanced damage whenever she lands a combo finisher, with you going from the 10 to 15% enhanced damage whenever you go to a different combo finisher. This is undoubtedly a good buff, but I still believe that Cagliostro is lacking somewhat when compared to some of the top tiers, and I really do believe that as you start to build up your characters, you're going to feel like Cagliostro is less and less useful. And so ultimately, Cagliostro is going to be more valuable depending on where you are in the game, but if you are at the end game, I would say that she is an A tier character. Next on the list we have Fairy, a character that can summon her ghost pets to deal more damage, to inflict debuffs on the enemy, or to buff herself and the party. Prior to this update, Fairy's optimal way of dealing damage was to actually simply do her aerial combos. However, that never really felt good to use, and after the developers removed the interaction that allowed Fairy to always keep on spamming the Skybound arts very quickly, she kinda ended up feeling like a much worse character than she was before. But thankfully the developers did give her a few compensation buffs by raising the damage cap of her charged square and triangle attacks, so Fairy can now actually be played the way that she was intended to. Still, as a damage dealer, Fairy ends up feeling lacking in some regards, though she is a medium-ranged character, so she is less susceptible to taking damage. On top of that, through her skills like Benediction, she's able to provide meaningful buffs to her allies, on top of lowering the enemy's defense or apply a slow, although I wouldn't really say that these are amazing buffs. Personally, especially with Benediction, I would hope that these numbers would be a little bit higher. You can go the damage route with Fairy by giving her Einrichten to gain supplementary damage, critical hit rate, and a 50% attack buff, on top of briefly becoming invincible. And with Umlauf you can also gain Stoutheart, which makes you uninterruptible and give you damage reduction. So in that sense, Fairy does have a lot of defensive options. As for Fairy's Warpath Sigil, it kinda works much in the same way as EO's Warpath Sigil, where you are essentially gambling for a way to deal more damage, as it is going to give you a 15% enhanced damage buff for 15 seconds if all of your pets land their hits whenever you are using the Onslaught. But now you're going to have a 50% chance to not dismiss your pets whenever you do so, which means that you would then be able to go into Onslaught once again, and if you are lucky enough you always bet on red and you always win, you'll be able to keep on spamming Onslaught after Onslaught to deal more damage. And at that point your damage output is actually going to be very high, although you're going to be relying on a lot of luck, and that is something that I personally dislike. So ultimately, whenever I look at the tier list and all of the characters that I have previously ranked, I honestly don't find myself saying that Fairy is better than any of these characters, and so despite how much I like her visually and actually playing her, I'm going to be ranking Fairy as a B tier character. Now the next character on the list is going to be Rosetta, potentially the character with the most unique kit in the entire game, as she is able to plant roses that can aid her allies and also deal damage to the enemies. Rosetta always ended up dealing a lot less damage compared to all the other characters in the roster, because she mainly suffered from using her actual kit. She had to take time from dealing damage to plant her roses, and whenever the boss moves around, she would then have to remove those plants to deal damage. Some skills would be able to help mitigate that damage loss, but even so, her damage output was nothing spectacular. In fact, it was actually quite low. Thankfully, Rosetta did get a very good amount of direct buffs, increasing the damage cap of Rosetta's skills and all around the damage of her plants based on their level. And it should be noted that Rosetta's plants, just by being there, can provide a meaningful defense buff to the entire party that is based on the rose's level. So just by existing, Rosetta already brings value to the party, which is something that a lot of characters do not do. On top of that, with Rose Barrier, she can provide an additional 40% damage cut to the entire party, and that is very valuable as well. And given how many times Rosetta and her plants actually attack the boss, she's a character that, despite not dealing a lot of damage, can actually build up the Skybound art gauge very quickly. In my experience as an AI companion, she tends to be the quickest to build up the SPA gauge. And then there is the new Warpath Sigil. This one works a little bit like its Warpath Sigil, as it is going to make it so that Rosetta's roses will deplete 200% faster. However, with the Sigil, her roses will now deal twice as much damage, and the attack and defense buff that they provide is going to be increased by 15%, or they will provide an additional 3% regen on top. Now, I'm not quite sure if these numbers are additive to the number that we have before, meaning that, for example, you add the already existing defense buff to this 15%, making it 55%, or if you get a 15% increase on the 40%. Still, I believe that making it so that the roses do more damage is a good thing, and again, Rosetta as a character already brings a lot of passive value, and this Warpath Sigil is essentially compounding on that concept. I still don't think that Rosetta is an amazing character, but she is by far much better than she was before. But again, much like with Fairy, when looking at the tier list and the way that I have ranked all of these characters, I find it hard to say that Rosetta is better than any of them, and so I'm going to be ranking Rosetta as a B tier character. And that is it for the rankings of Update 1.2 for Granblue Fantasy Relink. We saw a ton of buffs across the board, and as you can see, most of the characters in the roster are actually quite powerful. I think that this game's balance is actually quite good, that is, if you ignore the bugs, as you can make every single character in this game work very well, even in the endgame content. And I know that there are a lot of characters in the S tier, but I really do believe that they are that powerful, and I think it just goes to show that the developers are trying to fix and balance the game as much as they can. I'm very curious to see where Sandalphon is going to end up on the tier list once he is released, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. Let me know if you guys disagree with any of my placements, and with that being said, thank you all so much for watching. My name is Dark Hero, and as always, happy hunting!